Hello, hello, anybody there?
Yes, hello. Can you hear me?
Hey, yes I can. How are you, Steven?
I'm very good. How are you?
Oh, I'm well. Let's get the ball rolling here. I wanted to ask you where you're from and how your creative journey begins. Can you tell me a little bit about growing up?
Sure. I was born in California. We moved around some when I was a kid because my dad was in the army. So I lived in Germany for a few years. And then we moved to Colorado when I was 7. And I did most of my growing up in Colorado.
Mm,
And then I've moved around some since then. I went to college in Tennessee and moved to St. Louis 15 years ago at this point.
mm,
Um, so that's sort of the location wise. In terms of journey as a writer, I have always been fairly creative. It's always been writing. I can remember as far back as it must have been kindergarten or first grade, something in that general age range. I wrote a story. I think it was supposed to be a story about what you're going to do when you grow up,
mm.
and I wrote a story about how I was going to be a policeman who gave cheetahs speeding tickets for running too fast. And so that was the teacher loved it, my parents loved it, and I think it seems to me that's the first time I realized that I could make people be entertained by
Mm,
writing. And so it's always kind of been a thing for me. I When I was younger, I thought I was going to write fantasy novels, and I actually did try to do that. But it turns out that it's just the strange way my brain works. Anytime I
mm.
try to write a longer fiction piece, it ends up turning into a strange little poem instead. So that's pretty much I'm accepting of it at this point that I'm a poet first and foremost,
Mm.
and whatever sort of I mean, a lot of the things I write have sort of fantastical elements to them, fantasy or science fiction, things that are unreal, and so it definitely that thing that I thought I was going to be a long time ago got channeled into poetry instead, which works out fine.
Yeah, there tend to
Um,
be variants, of what we initially set out to do. There's always just like a lingering thing. It just takes on a different form.
Yeah, yeah. And of course, I was in high school when I thought that, and you have no idea what you're actually going to be in high school. So to some extent, I'm pretty pleased that I was at least fairly close to the mark.
That's right.
I was a writer, so that was a pretty good guess on my part, I think.
Oh, how awesome is that? Do you remember what you were enjoying when you were younger? Like what kind of stuff you were watching or reading when you were a kid?
Yeah, I think the sort of the formative literature for me is The Lord of the Rings. That was
Mm,
my parents read The Hobbit to me when I was very young, and then once I started reading on my own, I read The Hobbit, I read The Lord of the Rings. That was obviously what made me think I was going to write fantasy. And the thing for me about those that is truly amazing to me is the way that it builds an entire world,
hmm.
languages and maps and history, and most of that stuff isn't actually in the books. He had this whole history that he built up, this entire mythos, and then one little bit of that is those books. And I
Hmm.
love that kind of world building, and that's something
Yeah,
that I aspire to have that kind of world background in the things I'm thinking about.
yeah. So, do you remember what those early attempts were in that fantasy realm that made you decide that you were going to go maybe a different direction? Like, can you give me an example of those things? Like, what kind of story that might have been that you were writing?
Sure. Hey, I mean, it was high school. It was very cliched. It was extremely derivative. I don't remember. I was thinking of it as like a whole trilogy series of books, and I don't remember the exact the whole thing, but a lot of it was about how like magic had somehow been locked away, and someone was trying to do something to make magic like reappear in the world, essentially, but it was going to cause some sort of cataclysmic event.
Hmm.
And so just very like that kind of stuff is very much done already in
Hmm.
fantasy literature. But yeah, so I was thinking stories like that, and then at some point along the way, I think I realized, a if I was going to write fantasy novels, I would have to be a lot more original than that. But b the thing that really interest me, I think, are sort of the peripheral things around that. Just like there's a fantasy author named China Miéville, who's he writes just fantastic, creative, original stuff. And one
Mm.
of my favorite things about him is that he throws out ideas, and they're really interesting ideas, and he kind of follows them for a few pages, and then they disappear back out of his books again. Like
Oh.
it's the kind of idea that someone else would probably turn into an entire book, but he burns it off in a few pages. And so
Mm.
those just little tangential things are really some of my favorite aspects of that kind of writing. Just the weird little things about the fantasy world or about
Yeah.
science fiction world, whatever, unreal world.
It's like the possibility, right? So like it's maybe what could be the seed of a tangent, right? Or
Mhm.
a huge divergence, but they just leave you wondering. Is that kind of what you're talking about?
Yeah, yeah. In fiction and in movies, there's very much a tendency to sort of over-explain like everything that appears.
Mhm.
If it appears on screen or on the page, you have to, here's why this happened, and here's where.
Yeah.
Authors tend to feel a little insecure, I think, and so they have to like, here's everything about it. I have to explain it. Whereas if you just put something there and it's like, this is it, this is what it is. I really like that approach. It's just like you don't need to know everything about it. You just know that it's this really interesting thing.
Yeah. Yeah. So did you pursue this in school, or was this something that you had alongside the rest of your life that you were pursuing?
Well, and originally, it was alongside. When I went to college, I thought, I majored in computer science originally, and I thought I was going to
Mm.
design computer games for a living.
Mhm.
Which that would have been it would have been very cool to do that.
Yeah.
But I also got to college, and I was kind of unprepared for the step up in how much I had to work at it.
Oh
And
yeah.
I also discovered that even though I'm pretty good at math and computer programming and things like that, I don't truly enjoy it when it starts getting really like the
Mm.
linear algebra. I think I did really badly in, and then the hardcore assembly language kinds of classes. And so I realized that anything that I truly had to program in, I was not going to be, that was not a long term thing for me. So I ended up switching my major to English with an emphasis in creative writing at that point. So from
Mm.
then on, writing really was the first sort of thing.
Yeah, yeah. So were you able to use a lot of the writing experience or background in the work that you're doing now, or do you think it's still kind of your primary identity has to be on the side, like with the writing thing? Because I think that a lot of us like we have a difficult time putting in a lot of that writing into maybe our day jobs and things like that. Is that something that you have an issue with, or do you get to regularly use it in work?
I do write for my day job pretty often. I work for a marketing agency, and my primary responsibility is writing. I have a lot of different hats that I wear, but writing is a big part of it. But at the same time, it is still almost like two different identities, because the stuff I'm doing at work is not creative writing. It doesn't have, the fantastical elements. It's not poetic, nothing like that. And I very much keep my the poetry, all that sort of stuff, separate from the job. The people I work with know that I write poetry, know that I've published books, but on that, there's just they're really not interested in that, and that's fine. The one thing that happened at work one time is one of the people in the art department came up to me out of nowhere and said, "I didn't realize you were famous," and I had no idea what she was talking about. I said, "What do you mean?" And she said, "You have a Wikipedia entry," which I do. Which I thought that was her gauge for me being famous, which I thought was really funny. But for the
It's
most
pretty
part,
official. It's pretty
yeah,
cool. Yeah.
a little bit. Yeah, it is. It is nice, but it doesn't come up at work often, and I think that's good to some extent, because the
Yeah.
the writing I do at work doesn't take away my creative energies. It's just very like, it's a good balance. It doesn't use the same muscles, and so when I actually want to write poetry, I don't feel exhausted from writing during the work day.
Oh, that's phenomenal because I always wonder about that because in my capacity now in my day job, it's a lot of overlap, and
Mhm.
I wonder, am I ever going to get tired? Am I ever going to get overwhelmed? But it seems like you found a good balance there of this is a completely different form. This has no bearing on the creative output because it's, as you said, it's using different muscles. So,
Yeah.
As you're writing your poetry collections, I was going to ask you about the narrative aspect of them, because if you said that you initially started doing fiction or wanting to do that sort of work, is there still overlap, or do you feel like you have shed sort of the narrative longing, or do you still find narrative kind of making its way in there a little bit?
It's definitely still there. I have some kind of impulse to tell a story still for sure.
Mm,
Um, but it definitely much less so. Um, and even when it's there, I think it can be kind of strange. Like it's not it's a story, but it's not necessarily a story that makes immediate sense. You kind of
mm,
read it and you're like, I can tell there's like it's in the form of a story, but I can't tell exactly what's going on. It's
yeah.
not quite as it's not quite as simple as person A does thing B and it proceeds from there.
Uh-huh.
But and I think also my my poetry collections at this point don't have like a large scale narrative arc. I'll do
Mm,
narrative within an individual poem, but it's not like there's a beginning to end story in those books. The
yeah.
books have different sorts of unifying things. A lot of it is formal
Mm,
or like generalized subject matter. Like the most recent one is all sort of apocalyptic and dystopian themes, but
that's
it's
awesome.
not like there's it was a lot of fun, but there's not like a specific story that it's telling from the beginning of the book to the end of the book. So
Yeah.
to some extent, I have shed that narrative.
So before we get to Wikipedia Apocalyptica, I'd love to ask you a little bit more about that. But could we talk about your first one, which was the Royal Nonsuch? Was that correct?
No, that's the second one.
Oh, this is this. Oh, okay. So
Yeah,
you're at two. You got two.
no, three, three.
Three. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
First one is called Torched Verse Ends. Royal Nonesuch is the second one, and then
Okay.
Wikipedia Apocalyptic is the third.
Okay, great, great. Thank you for clarifying, because I
No
wanted to
worries.
ask the progression of those, and sort of how the development of your poetry came into being from the first one to this
Sure.
third publication.
Yeah. So the first book was very much less cohesive. I think a lot of first books for people are that way. Where for
Hmm.
me, it was I had been writing poetry for quite a while at that point, and I had a lot of poems that were pretty good. 50 to 100 poems that were
Hmm.
just kind of sitting there. And I started thinking about, well, it seems like I should put a book together. Let's kind of figure out how these all fit. And
Yeah.
then a lot of them ended up in the book. Some of them didn't fit at all. But it's very much just a like this is all my early work. Here's a way I figured out to make it into a book.
Yeah.
Um, and it's interesting also that first book you're talking about the way I've developed that first book. Now if I read it, I still like a lot of the poems, but it's very much not the way I write anymore. It's almost like reading poetry by someone else.
Oh, wow.
Like
Yeah.
I can recognize things I was thinking about or why I did what I did, but it's just not the way I would think about it or do it anymore. Yeah, I think it's just the natural effect of that those poems were written 15 plus years ago, and so you change a lot as a person, you change a lot as a writer. But I don't know, maybe some people don't keep changing as writers, but I think most of us do. You learn new things, you do different things, and so yeah, it's very much different. But then the next book after that, kind of I find it helps me to have some sort of constraint to my writing. So I'm not
Hmm.
just trying to figure out what I should do completely from scratch every time. So
Hmm.
the second book ended up having some of my sort of I mean they're kind of obsessions. Maybe that's slightly too strong a word, but I was specifically trying to get some element of unreality in there because I like that, not being strictly realist. And then I was also thinking about kind of how different poems, different literature, different entertainment influences me. And so all the poems in that second book have titles that I took from other sources,
Mm.
from lines of someone else's poetry or movie quotes or things like that.
Oh,
And
great.
then use that as kind of just that kind of influence on me just made it plain.
Yeah. Looking at that collection in particular, when you were done with that, what was your reaction? How did you feel about it going from the first to the second one? Because that seems like a big turning point for you, right? Did you feel like you had a grasp on the work you were doing?
Yeah, definitely more so than the first one. The first one, I was, very much a baby poet and still figuring things out. And that book, the first one was published in 2009 and was
Mm.
represented about roughly 7 years of poetry. Um,
Mm.
although a lot of it had been more recent. But then the next one represented, it was 2013. So I wrote it faster than I'd written the first one. And it having that kind of the the constraints on it made it really feel like a collection to me. And that was one thing I felt like I figured out, where it felt like an actual book the whole time I was writing it. Even when I was just working on individual poems, I could tell it was part of a whole, which was really nice
Oh,
to
that's awesome.
know that. Yeah, and I did. You know, I'll never feel like I truly have a handle on writing or publishing or any of that, but I definitely felt better about the second one in terms of, being able to apply what I learned on the first one,
Yeah.
and knowing more about publishing and about writing, and I I've been happy with how all my books turned out, as
Oh,
like how
awesome.
they look and the physical object. They're very nice, but that second one, it really did. It made me happy. It looks nice. It was a great experience to work with that press. Um,
And
so yeah.
who did that one come out through?
Oh,
What was the
it was
press?
called Sparkwheel Press.
Oh, okay. Positive experience in the editing process and that sort of thing. It felt
Oh
very,
yeah.
oh, good,
Yeah,
good.
it was great. Yeah, they were great about getting the book out there. They about just working with me to. We did some editing of the manuscript after they accepted it,
Hmm.
and their suggestions were great on that, and they made it such a nice looking book too. Like one of the women who ran that press did the cover art as well, and I was
Mm.
just super happy with that.
Oh, that's awesome. You get a good representation there, it makes it a bit more appealing to folks who are looking at their options for sure. So, when does the zine come into the picture? Because this is I was reading some of the poetry in there. I love the stance. It's an anti-capitalist publication, but I'd like you to tell me a little bit more about it when it comes into the picture and maybe how it makes its way into your writing, how it influences you and the work that you're doing now.
Sure. Yeah. So the journal I edit now is called, well, it's dollar sign. But since it's hard to, it's an actual dollar sign. So the tagline for it is poetry is currency, which is what I think most people actually call it.
Hmm.
Um, I think I'll have to like step back a little bit in time.
Yeah.
I have edited small literary journals for a long time, different ones. There was one
Mm,
back in Colorado when I was there for a local organization. And then I edited a different online poetry magazine called Anti from 2007 to 2014.
mm.
Um, and that one, the sort of gimmick was anybody I published had to make a little anti statement, which was a statement of what they were against in poetry. So I like to have those sorts of little things, the little hangers to remember, make the journal unique. And so that one I stopped because I got a little burned out after editing it for 7 years.
Mm,
But I really like um, editing a journal of my own. Just a small operation.
yeah,
Um, it feels like a really good way to build community and sort of help out other writers, because writers want to publish, but at the same time, um, it's helpful to me too. I get to read a good sampling of what people are writing now, and I get to discover some poems that I really love and put them out there in the world.
yeah.
So I'd had the kind of the itch to restart editing for quite a while, and I finally made the jump again in 2021.
Oh, that's
That was
amazing.
when the dollar sign came into being. So I've been doing it for about 2 years now. Your other part of the question was sort of how it affects my writing, and it absolutely does. Basically, like I said, seeing um, some of the best of what poetry is being written now, and because we're a
Hmm.
small journal, we tend to get writing from younger, newer poets, and so I get to discover writers that way too, and um, it really is helpful to my own writing to be able to see what people are doing,
Yeah,
and just kind of get the idea. I really like when writing does this. I don't like quite as much when writing does this, and just have that kind of
right,
immediate reference.
right. Am very curious about the curation element of it because obviously editing a journal of any kind is more than just curation. It is sort of trying to get the sensibility of something and maybe clarifying, right? How you feel about some things. Did you
Mhm.
feel like you've always known the things that have appealed to you, or do you think that it's less rigid than that as
Um,
you're doing this?
yeah, it's I mean, it's a kind of a little bit of both again. Some of the things that I like, I've always known I liked, or for a long time anyway. The the things things that I like to try to do in my own writing, like very rich, sound heavy kinds of poetry where there's a lot of internal rhyme and just very, very sonic things that are enjoyable to read or to hear read. I know I've liked that for a long time. I try to write a lot of my own poems that way. And I'll sometimes get poems for the journals I edit where I can just looking at it on the page go, oh, this is going to be fun to read out loud, and then I have to read it out
Mm,
loud and hear just the
yeah.
sounds, and so that's one that I have a really good idea of. But there are definitely things that I wouldn't have thought I liked, or in some cases even that I think I don't particularly like, and then someone will send a really good example of
Mm,
that I have to admit. Oh, one thing would be I tend to be very skeptical of poems about poetry.
mm.
I think that tends to get into sort of meta navel gazing kind of stuff, and I'm always at least somewhat suspicious of it. But from time to time, someone will send me uh, a poem for the journal or for one of the previous ones I edited, where it's clearly a poem about poetry, but it's just really well done and it's fun. And I'm like, well, this even if I don't like poems about poetry, this one's really good.
No, that's great to hear. And specifically about the anti-capitalist stance
Mhm.
of the zine, I think this is a very important perspective, and I want to know how you solidified that. If you could tell me the genesis of that idea, and maybe how that resonated with you as a poet.
Yeah, I think um, for me, it's very much. I mean, I am in a general sense anti-capitalist, which is, I mean, it's kind of ironic that I work for a marketing agency that markets,
Yeah.
you know, financial services and stuff. That's just, that's a side note. But uh, and the most recent book also has a lot of sort of anti-capitalist stuff in there too. But really, the reason I think I wanted to make the journal be like that is that I think poetry publishing has gotten really capitalist in a lot of ways. It's
Mm,
very much like people treat it as a zero-sum game where if one poet doesn't get if one poet gets published and another poet is getting left out, left behind, and there's so much money going into it. The journals that use Submittable and charge submission fees, and I think
yeah.
you know especially if you're paying your contributors, great. But I think so much of the beauty of publishing poetry is that it doesn't have to be about money at all. It can just be about the journal I have doesn't cost a lot of money to run. It's my own money
Mhm,
and not a lot of it, and I put it out there, and the nobody's getting paid.
mhm,
But it's about finding the best poetry you can find and putting it in front of people, letting people experience it,
mhm.
um, and giving the poets uh, some some attention that some deserved attention for their work.
Yeah,
And so I think I like it a lot better when money is taken out of the equation. And
right.
uh, there's so many good writers who don't have much money, and being a writer getting published now tends to require so much money between submission fees, book contests, things like that,
Right.
that I don't the money aspect of literary publishing is something that I want to fight against.
Yeah. That's a beautiful sentiment and a beautiful service that you're providing to a lot of folks, especially those who wouldn't have the ability to feel like they're a part of a community. And I just want to thank you for that because it's so important, especially in this day and age when you can find community in many ways. It's just a perfect avenue for what many people are looking for. I really enjoy this idea of how you're balancing the two parts of your life. I loved how eloquently you said that because, yeah, in the daytime you are doing a lot of this marketing stuff, but it seems like a balancing act more than anything for your own soul. Is that kind of how it is?
Yeah, that's fair to say. It's yeah, I tend to be sort of I'm emotionally invested in the poetry side. I'm not as emotionally invested in the work, and I couldn't work at a job where I actively felt like we were doing harm in some way.
Mhm.
The I think the things we're marketing are generally certainly in the world we live in, they're necessities. We're
Yeah,
advertising for banks and things like that, and
sure.
banks. There's nothing
We need
inherently
banks.
wrong with the bank. There's nothing inherently wrong with it. Obviously, some banks are doing bad things, but we're not advertising bad things. We're advertising services that are actually useful to people. So I don't worry about it in
Right.
that sense. And it's it's sort of I'm aware it's just an effect of the world we live in, that you have to make a living, and
Yeah,
as long as you're not being evil in what you're doing, I think it's
right.
you accept that.
Yeah. I love that because you're reconciling in
Yeah.
the way that is I think it's not black and white, man. We live in a very, very gray world, and we have
Oh
to
yeah.
do the best we can to balance those things out. But, getting to your latest collection, Wikipedia Apocalyptica, um, it says here in the description, "The story is a temporally ambiguous dystopia, locates the city in its state of crisis, laying bare the hollowness of consensus reality." That is a lot, and it's beautiful. I love it so much. So, can we talk a little bit about how you arrive as a poet to this collection, and if you had any intention on what you wanted to achieve before you started writing, or if it came to you?
Yeah, sure. So I will say also that the blurb you just read was actually written by the press, which I'm so happy they did it because it sounds really cool. I would not have ever been able to come up with that myself to say that about my book. So I'm glad they were kind enough to do that for me. Um, but yeah, this book, um, I had started writing more sort of socially and politically aware poetry in the second book. There
Mm,
was a fairly even split between more personal and more political kinds of poetry,
mm,
and then it was just I don't know, I was feeling more and more uh, skeptical or unhappy about the direction of the country, the world, everything. And so I just realized it was going to be a fairly heavily political collection,
mm,
political, social, just generally, even if they weren't directly about political or social issues, it's very much sort of reflective of the chaotic state our world is in. Um,
yeah,
and then very early on, the apocalyptic and dystopian themes that are just sort of naturally there anyway.
mhm,
um, I decided to make to foreground those, and that was easy for me to do because I really enjoy those sorts of entertainments anyway. Post-apocalyptic movies, books, games, whatever. I love the Mad Max series of movies. Love playing the Fallout series of computer games, and just that sort of environment is almost second nature to me. So it was very easy for me to think about the tropes of that kind of thing, and
right.
then think about, all right, how do I make a poem out of this, and how do I sort of tie it into the actual world we live in?
Mm. Can you give me an example of a poem in the collection that was just a pain in the ass, that wasn't gelling, that maybe took a little bit longer than the rest, and how you went about mending that or helping it along?
Oh boy. Oh man. I mean, a lot of them I tend to write pretty slowly.
Mm,
And I used to write a lot faster than I do now. So really, a lot of the books, or I mean, I'm sorry, a lot of the poems in the book came along very slowly. Like I would have sort of an overarching idea and a few lines, and then it would take me a long time to figure out how it got from point A to point B, or what the overall
mhm,
gist of the thing was.
yeah,
And I don't know if I can think of a specific one, but yeah, in terms of how I generally handle that, when I have an uncooperative poem, I kind of play it by ear in terms of, if it's just a little bit that's not cooperating, I will keep sort of poking away at it. I'll just keep if it's a couple lines, I'll keep writing different lines into that. And even if they don't work, I'm still thinking about it, thinking about how to improve it.
Hmm.
But then if it's something where I know it's a good overall idea, but there's just huge chunks of it missing, a lot of the time with something like that, I have to accept that I can't do this right now. I'm just going to have to put it away. I put it in a file folder somewhere. And
Hmm.
then sometimes I'll have another idea for it months later and I'll be able to come back and finish it.
Hmm.
Sometimes I won't finish it at all and it'll end up, I'll be writing another poem and I'll think, oh, one of those lines in that poem I didn't finish is actually perfect for this, and I'll grab that line and put it into the new poem. So I try to tend
Mm.
to be fairly fluid about how I treat poems that aren't really in a finished state yet, because
Uh-huh.
they if I can't think of a way to use a great line in one poem, I can probably eventually pull it into something else.
So keep a repository of all the stuff that didn't work, because it might help you later on. It might be the saving grace of the next one then.
Yep, for sure.
So, in the editorial process, working with others, have you had somebody to bounce ideas off of for the collection, or somebody to kind of help you through this process? What's that been like for you?
I have a number of different people that I bounce ideas off of, or that I have read drafts, things like that. There's a group locally here in St. Louis that I'm part of. We're called the TikTok Poets because we used to meet at this place called the TikTok Tavern.
Oh no, so
Um,
it got hijacked.
yeah,
The name got hijacked a little bit. Sorry, go ahead.
yeah, yeah. But so they see a lot of my drafts in progress and give me incredibly valuable feedback on the individual poems and then kind of where they fit in um, the overall project I'm working on, or the kind of my general my tone, the way I usually write poetry, and so
Hmm.
it's very helpful to have that.
When did you start writing this up until when you finished it, would you say?
It's actually a number of years. It's
Okay.
probably about 8 years worth of poems. So
Oh
I
wow.
started about when I
Okay.
published the last book, which was 2013,
Okay.
and then I was largely done with it by 2020. I think I wrote one or two poems. I know I wrote one that was um, the thing that begins the book. That's like a version of the like live updates of COVID. Uh,
Mm.
that I wrote obviously after the pandemic started,
Uh-huh.
and maybe one or two others, but mostly it was done by 2020. And then I shopped it around for the better part of, I mean, 2 years really. It got
Wow.
accepted in fall of 2021.
Oh, that's great. Do you feel like there was a sense of atonement over a lot of these political, societal, or maybe even hardships of the pandemic that you feel like the book helped you process in a way, or is it less of an emotional process for you to let the book out into the world, or more of I'm just doing the work, moving on to the next one.
These poems, I don't think it was quite as much about emotional processing. Like the things I'm writing right now actually are more personal, and I think that probably there is more of that. Like, what's really bothering me? Why is it bothering me? And that kind of gets into the poem, and that does help with emotional processing.
Mm-hmm.
These poems were more sort of outwardly focused, so I think it was more about um, like I want to shine a light on things,
Mm-hmm.
and say, look at this thing that's wrong. Here's why I think it's wrong. And the poems are not quite that blatant obvious about it, but that's kind of my thinking about it.
Uh-huh.
And it's more of, well, and also I think I want to kind of implicate myself in these problems too. I don't want to be like this outside guy pointing and saying, "Hey, this
Mm-hmm.
is everything that's wrong." I want to be, I have to acknowledge
Right.
many of the things that are going on. I'm certainly part of the issue, and in a big picture way, I think acknowledging that and then asking yourself, what are you going to do differently, is a really important thing. And so that's kind of what I wanted to do in some of those poems, at least, was
Mm-hmm.
make myself acknowledge it and hopefully make the reader think about that too. But if I don't achieve that, at least I'm achieving it with myself.
Right. Do you feel like having done something that is more outward, is it more accessible for you to go back to the internal, to the more personal? Or do you feel like it sharpens you to bring the internal stuff out. Like you've taken a break from doing the personal work to
Yeah.
kind of come back out.
Yeah, it's really nice to be able to transition back. But I do find that I can probably, I'll get a little bit rusty at the one thing when I haven't done it in so long.
Yeah.
But just the fact that I do feel like I need to keep changing things up. And so whether
Right.
that's, going from writing a long poem to writing a short poem, or going from writing external to internal, whatever it is, I want to keep changing things, keeping them fresh. And so when I finished this collection and started writing a little bit more personal poems, it was a bit of a there was a bit of a warming up process required, where
Mm-hmm.
I was like, I haven't really written about myself in a long time. How do
Yeah.
I go about doing that? Like, I barely remember how. But then once I started thinking about it a little bit and writing a little bit, a lot of it came back, and it's just a
Yeah.
matter of, like, finding a poetic way to talk about the things I already know that I have as personal concerns. And so
Right.
it was refreshing to do that.
Oh, that's awesome. Do you
Yeah.
ever write about home? Do you write about maybe Colorado or St. Louis in certain respects, or um, is there something that you might need to work through in terms of location? Because I'm always fascinated by that, and how some poets incorporate a lot of where they're at physically, or maybe a longing for another home. Is that something that you've experienced in the past, having moved from Colorado to St. Louis, or maybe having that kind of longing for home?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think, well, first, I still consider Colorado home, even though I haven't
Mm-hmm.
lived there in over 15 years.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and to some extent, St. Louis is home, but it always it feels to me more like a temporary home, whereas
Mm,
Colorado just feels like home, home.
yeah.
And I have definitely written a lot about home. I've written about Colorado a good amount. Not so much anymore. I'm not writing poems of place quite so much anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And I've never written a lot of poems about St. Louis at all, which is curious. It really
Yeah.
seems like I should have, and that almost seems like a thing to think about going forward. Just why haven't I done that?
Yeah.
Um, and a lot of my things about home, like, I have a lot of different sort of obsessions with home. Like, I have a poem. This is an older one where, for a long time, uh, anytime I dreamed about, like, my home, a house, it was the house I lived in when I was in my early to mid teens.
Mm,
It was always that house. And I didn't
yeah.
dream about earlier houses. I didn't dream about later houses. And so I was just, like, trying to figure out, like, why is that the one that stuck
Yeah.
in my memory? And a lot of it obviously is just, that's an extremely formative age that for everybody.
Mm-hmm.
And there was there other issues, like, emotionally, that was when my parents got divorced, was when I lived in that
Mm,
house. So I think that's a
yeah.
lot of stuck. So the, thinking of home in that regard is interesting, and also just home in terms of not necessarily a geographic place, but just like the a condition where you feel like you are home. That kind of
Yeah. Yeah.
concept is really good to me. And there are times where wherever I am, I feel that, where I'm, like, with the people I care most about, and I just, like, everything feels warm and secure, and that kind of home is important to me too.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's beautiful to think about, because we hold on to certain scars, certain moments, and it feels like the tired phrase of core memories, but
Mhm.
it's so important to actually try to go back and mine them. I've been struggling with this, so I'm curious what your take is. That sometimes I feel like I'm taking advantage of my memories in some way to publicize them, to get them out into the world. Um, i- is there a healthy way in your thinking to address these things without feeling like, you know, I'm airing my dirty laundry, or I'm just letting everybody know my business, especially my past
Yeah.
traumas and things like that. Do you ever have any hangups about that sort of thing?
Um, I don't exactly. I do have. So, speaking of airing dirty laundry, it wasn't exactly that, but I used to, when I was a much younger poet, I would show my family my poems in progress, and
Mm,
like my dad and my mom, and they were very supportive. But at one point, I wrote a poem sort of about our extended family and showed it to my dad, And then without asking me, he showed it to my grandmother, who got very upset because she thought that I had inaccurately portrayed something about the family. She wasn't
Oh,
angry, but she was very sad. And so the next time
yeah.
I saw her, she was like talking to me about how you have to tell the truth, and she was kind of crying about it. And
Oh,
a, I think I don't think I was untruthful about anything, but B, I realized you can't, like, I had to ask my dad, never show anything to grandma again, because she just, like, she doesn't understand that kind of poetry, and that there's an emotional truth there, and that
right.
and also, maybe poetry should make you sad if it's that, if it's this a sad sort of situation you're talking about. It shouldn't be feel good.
Wow.
But that's tangential also to your original question, about, how to deal with the fact that you're using these memories and putting them out there.
Uh-huh.
Um,
Yeah.
and I don't worry too much about it, I guess. I have, though, I will say, written in these recent poems I've been writing. A lot of them are about memory, the ways we remember, the things we remember when we start to forget, things like that.
Mhm.
Um, and the a big portion of the sort of um, the spur for me to do that is that my stepmom is going through early stage Alzheimer's, and she
Mm.
is very much losing her memory.
Oh,
And um, and so, like, that's always been kind of one of my real fears, is when I start losing my mental capacities, because that's one of the best things I have.
yeah.
And so, uh, I think, honestly, to get back to your question, um, I think the poetry where you're putting your memories out there is actually extremely valuable for that. That you're taking the memory while you still remember it, while you still know that thing, and you're putting it down on paper so that it is in a, if not permanent form, something longer lasting than the actual
Mm.
human memory is.
Yeah. It's a beautiful way to state it, man. And I'm sorry to hear, about your family at this time. It's a tough situation. But
Yeah.
speaking of the collection here, what are you hoping that folks will take away from Wikipedia Apocalyptica?
I honestly, I don't know if I have a thing I would want them to take away. I want them to feel like that that they were entertained, but also unsettled a little bit.
Hmm.
That the poems they're fun, they're clever, but also they're making you think a little bit about the ways things are kind of messed up right now,
Hmm.
and how kind of a lot of it, I think, being about the ways language gets used and misused and abused, to kind of put untruth out there to support bad faith people.
Hmm.
And so, yeah, I guess it's kind of a muddled answer, because I don't necessarily think there's a specific thing I want you to take away, but definitely just, you
Right.
know the power of words to do both good and evil.
Hmm. Yeah. And sometimes it's okay to not have anything be like the banner of a message or anything, but yeah, that's well put, man. I really appreciate that. Just got a couple more to be mindful of your time, but what are some things that you're experiencing right now that are inspiring you, that are making you feel alive, making you dive into your work with a kind of vitality?
Wow. Okay, so the most recent thing that I think is in line with the way I think about writing and the things I really enjoy is the Star Wars series Andor,
Oh,
which
okay.
was a fantastic series, and very socially aware, and about the ways, the kinds of things in Wikipedia Apocalyptica, where the ways uh, bad faith actors take over, and how how change happens, and it's messy, and even people who are on the right side are doing not good things, and just that
Mm,
kind of the messiness of it, and just the real, like, especially in a universe where Star Wars tends to be very black and white. Like you said before, we live in a gray world, and this is
mm-hmm.
this is one of the first Star Wars things where it's very much in a gray world.
Mm.
Don't see that very often, so I'm very glad for that. And it's also a lot of fun, very well done. So anything that I look at and see is really well written. That very much inspires me to write, even if it's obviously a completely different kind of writing.
Oh, that's great. So, what are some things that you're doing right now to work on your craft, to try to solidify habits? Are there some things that are tried and true for you when it comes to sitting down and just getting the work done?
Yeah, I think the thing I try to do is, in terms of craft, uh, is not just by default fall back into the things that I usually do. I have certain moves and styles and things that are always there, and I just don't want to be writing those same things every time. And so I try to um, think about something in craft terms or form terms that I maybe I did once but haven't really done regularly, or just something that I've always thought, hey, I would like to write this way.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and then just make a point of trying to write something in that, like one thing that I'm doing a lot in poems now that didn't I don't usually have a tendency to do, but it's something that I really like, is very short lines that have just like a couple beats per line, and that still hold together really well. Like it's not just really awkward line breaks. All the line breaks make sense. It's just very like, when that's done well, I think the rhythms you can get out of that are really fantastic. It's not a
Mm-hmm.
way that I often write, but I decided, hey, I'm going to try it. I'm going to like make a point of doing this different formal thing, and I'm going to keep at it.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I've actually been really pleased with the results of that. Sometimes those things don't work out at all. Like I'll try it and it's worth trying, but at the end I go, nope, that's never going to be good that way. I'm going to have to turn it into something that's more like what I usually do. But these have actually, I think, gone very well and stayed true to that form.
Oh, that's amazing. And that actually covers what I was going to ask you last, which was maybe some bits of insight or advice for somebody who is starting on their creative journey. I feel like you covered that pretty well, but if there's any additional thoughts on that, would be greatly appreciated.
Oh yeah. So my standard advice for younger writers is always fairly similar. It's essentially read, read, read. If you want to be a writer, hopefully you like reading the kinds of things that you want to write.
Mhm.
You really need to. And then, yeah, just, keep developing your own voice, your own style. And young writers probably don't have a lot of that yet. And that's
Mhm.
fine. You go along the road, you figure that stuff out. You don't have to worry about it right away. Just keep developing, and that stuff comes along.
It's amazing, man. Well, I really want to thank you for your time. This has been such a blast, and I want to thank you for the work that you're doing. This is just right up my alley in terms of the sensibility of using this kind of, I don't want to say spectacle, but there is a kind of showcase there of what would happen if we go down the wrong path. Right? That kind of
Right.
seems to be like the draw for the apocalyptic nature of it. I love it so much and I can't wait to check it out, man. But I really just want to thank you for your time and for making this an awesome conversation. So I hope that you have a wonderful Sunday.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you so much. This has been great.
Yeah, man. Hope to stay in touch and I will bug you on the internet.
Okay. Sounds good.
All right, man. Take care. Talk to you soon.
Yep. Bye.
Bye.